Here on the Colour of Country Life Flow FM, it's great to be chatting with Matt Dalgleish again. I caught Matt at the Growing SA conference. Matt and you and Andrew Whitelaw were both looking pretty fine from Thomas Elder Markets.
Yeah, it was good to catch up in person, Rikki, and see some of the fine people from South Australia and what they're doing in the ag space. It was an excellent conference.
And there was a lot of conversation there about a host of things, not particularly to do with adapting, I guess, to whether it's climate change or the requirement that we do things as farmers when it comes to how we run our properties regarding climate change. It's one of those market inputs, I guess, that's going to be an effect. I guess you'd call it, a cost of production.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a huge talking point presently with how high things like fertiliser and fuel and those type of input costs are at the moment. But I think one thing to take out of it was that the agricultural sector, in my view, is very much part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Absolutely. Now, when we look at how the market's been travelling this week, the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator, look, we're back after that dip that we saw in recent weeks, very quickly back to where we were around the same time last year. And I gather that's had whilst there was some concern about foot and mouth disease, some say it was more to do with processors and labour needs, which is quite relevant given the Jobs and Skills Summit going on in Canberra this week.
Yeah, that's right. I think some of certainly the final stages of that sell-off through mid-July was probably a little bit of panic selling through FMD, but prior to that, there was, kind of weakening just because of those labour issues at the meatworks, and then that was then exacerbated by those big numbers. But we seem to have recovered, and certainly if you look at the slaughter figures from last week, we had, I think, the highest or second highest weekly slaughter figures this year, so the processors are starting to get on top of that, and we're seeing the prices recover accordingly as well.
Yeah, we noticed from Meat and Livestock Australia as well some commentary that they also think that the restocking process is well and truly in good health when they did the data dive, I guess, into the female animals that were being bought, and then also the male, the bulls that were being purchased to be joined, as they creatively described them, to create more cattle.
Yeah, that's right, and we look at a particular indicator, the female slaughter ratio, that looks at the number of female cattle slaughtered as a proportion of total slaughter, and that level currently on an annual basis is the lowest it's been since the 1990s, and that's pretty consistent with a strong herd rebuild. I think MLA are looking at a herd rebuild of about 5.6% now for this year, and the numbers show that you probably could expect. I mean, the last 4 times we've seen the female slaughter ratio as low as it is now, we saw growth in the herd of between 2.5% to 7.5%. So that 5.5 or so that MLA are forecasting is pretty much bang in the middle of that range, and it seems like that's about what we could expect this year.
Yeah, and where does I keep wondering about this because I haven't got my finger on the figures, but where do we look? Are we looking in terms of herd numbers compared to, say, the record when it comes to in Australia? How many years of successive rebuild would be needed for us to get to record levels?
Yeah, I think we'd probably need another couple of years at least. I think we're at about 27 million or so, maybe a fraction of that, 27.6, and the record's up around the low 30s, 32 or 33 from memory in terms of recent history. So we've got a bit of way to go before we get up above 30 million head, I think, and there's probably a fair chance we're going to see a drier patch in the next few years, so that might take a bit of the steam out of this rebuild.
And how about on the sheep front? Prices are lower this time last year than they were the previous year, but as people keep saying, still in pretty decent form, and even in the last week they've picked up quite significantly.
Yeah, that's right. And the sheep and the lamb side was the side of the market that did get more heavily impacted by that sell-off process in July, and part of that was, again, the processing constraints, particularly in Victoria due to COVID and flu and everything like that. That they took a bit more of a hit, but they have recovered, and you're right, they're up about, I think, across the averages, up about 50 or so cents this week, and at pretty good levels, historically. So it's still below what they were this time last year, but when you look at the longer term trend, they're looking pretty strong. Those flock numbers in terms of growth of the flock, that's looking very strong. We've got another type of a ratio we look at, it's a sheep turnover ratio. It's the same type of thing that measures how strong the rebuild is, and that's sitting at 9.1%, which is the lowest on our records. We'd go back to 1989, and that would indicate a growth of the flock of about 8% this year, which is going to get it right up to that 76 million head or so. Yeah,
and again, just where does that sit compared to the historical record? I imagine Australia carried a lot more sheep than that when it reached record levels some years ago.
Absolutely, up through the 90s prior to the wool reserve kind of crash. It was up around, I think, 140 million head or thereabouts. So we're just getting back to kind of half the levels we had. But you do have to remember, Rikki, that it's the different demographic of sheep flock now. Back then it was pretty much merino and wool, whereas now we're seeing a lot more of those crossbred and, kind of meat sheep, prime lamb stuff operations, and they have a better kind of higher fecundity and higher marking rates. So we are a bit more productive with those lower numbers of sheep. but we're turning off higher numbers of lambs than what we were historically.
Fantastic wrap for us, Matt, on across the cattle and the sheep sectors. Enjoy your trip in Queensland, I believe you are. Hope the weather's treating you nicely.
Yeah, mate, I'm up here for the API conference in Toowoomba, so for a Victorian, it's pretty dangerous coming up and not getting stuck in the hot weather, but it's cool today and raining, so I'm very happy.